Yeah. Just to explain, the Federal Communication Commission auctions what is known as spectrum, right? The use of any spectrum that has not been purchased is the illegal use of spectrum. Now, to make it simple, spectrum can be a frequency, right? It can be a certain amount of broadband, yes. But let's say precedence is the consequence of custom, right? Mhm. The customs of a population should not be drawn into precedent because customs change, right? The consequence of any precedent setting decision, yes, should be because of the laws that exist. Right. Now, these customs, known as societal customs, they should not be prejudicial to truth. And then a prescriptive and legitimate custom overcomes the law. Now, this is somewhat interesting, right? Prescriptive and legitimate custom. Let's say you're a citizen of the United States. Somebody files a 2 count criminal complaint against you. You have the actual evidence that you didn't commit a crime, but they won't admit that. So they say, well, you're crazy. Right. Now, the prescriptive and legitimate custom of the mental health evaluation, yes. Something that the defense wanted, or was it the prosecution? Cool. Overcoming the actual law of the speedy trial, yes. The federal rules of criminal procedure and the use of evidence, yes. Evidence should always be required. Now, numerous emails or hundreds of different email addresses. And then there's the question of actual date and time. Where did the crime happen and what day and what time? Yes. Mhm. Now, I know that whole day I was not in Brennan. Yeah. And it was more than numerous recipients. Yeah. But I can say that none of the actual recipients were the actual co-workers of my wife. Now, the same woman, right, that didn't sign this. Let's look at number 9. Okay. Other. Okay. Court will review upon motion of respondent. Yes. hmm Now, this idea of the court reviewing my motion as the respondent, yes. When the court did not give me any notice of court hearings, yes. The court did not have court hearings within the requirements of the RCWs, yes. There was no proof of service to myself before having court hearings, right. And the court issued it for 10 years without the petitioner acknowledging receipt of the court order. And then there's the use of forgeries. Right. Now, you want me to have you, the court, review my motion as the respondent. Yes. When there are forgeries, there is fraud, there's misrepresentation, there's the violating of civil rights, there's the actual damage done to my sons for 7.5 years because of your abuse of power? Yes. And then there's the concept of school starting tomorrow. Yeah. And you, the state of Washington, are going to continue to employ my wife. Now, this custom of once you're a teacher, you're always a teacher, and that the prescriptive and legitimate custom of teaching students, yes, should overcome the law, or the law should be enforced. Custom is not to be drawn into the precedent setting of keeping students in the wrong grade when you know they are not in the right grade. And you do not continue to employ government employees, right, when you know they have committed a crime. Ooh. Now, I think the consequence of precedence, yes, should be because of the interpretation of law. Yeah. And there is this idea of consent, right? This acknowledgement of the non-existent petitioner consenting to the court commissioner issuing the protection order for 10 years, yes. Consent and not concubinage constitutes marriage, yes. Now there's a big question of getting married. Let's say I employed a woman as my concubine. I paid her $10,000 a month. I paid her her actual living expenses, spending account, so on and so forth. And then we got married. The judge says, "Are you happy together?" I'm like, "Yeah, I pay her $10,000 a month to marry me." Is that consent to marriage or is that concubinage? Knowing what I know about concubines, right, usually there is a contractual agreement to a certain amount of money being used to support the individual in their housing, yes, their actual expenses as a concubine, and quite possibly any other fees that might be associated, yes. Now, this concubinage, yes, known as employing somebody to be your spouse, yes, yes. That is not consent, okay? That's a contractual obligation to pay somebody for sex. Yes. We don't call it prostitution. That's why they call it concubinage. Now, consent, yes, takes away error. Consent is toilet error. There is the concept of the consenting signature of the petitioner. I acknowledge receipt of a copy of this order. Yes. Let's say there was no consent because there was no signature. Right. That means it does not take away error. Let's say the court commissioner made an error. Probably has a bonding of some sort. Yes. That bonding has a lot to do with the actual amount of money that the oath of office has direct access to. Yes. I wouldn't think a whole bunch. Right. Now, there's not a need for a large bond for a Superior Court judge or a District Court judge because they just don't handle a lot of actual money, as in the checks are written to them or the cash is given to them. Right. They oftentimes fall under the actual insurances of the county or the state or the United States, or they have an umbrella policy. Let's say I was upset at Brent Basin. Yes. And there was no consent of the petitioner to issue this protection order. Pooch. I would say he was in error, as in error and omissions. I'd sue him for all that he owns. I'd sue his insurance company. Yeah. I'd sue his employer, known as Cloud County. I'd sue the state of Washington, and then I'd sue every state of the United States. Article 4, Section 1. Now, consentia agents para beneposentia. Those consenting, and those perpetrating are embraced in the same punishment. Yes. Now, this is a confusing one, but I thought there was a really big lawsuit in this. Those consenting and those perpetrating are embraced in the same punishment. Let's say the petitioner didn't consent to the protection order, but she did consent to some sort of domestic violence that happened on June 16th of 2017. And the perpetrator of the crime that victimized the consenting, yes, they were embraced in the same punishment, but the punishment to the perpetrator, yes, was a kind of reward to the consenting. Now, let's say you're a victim. You're there in the courtroom, okay? And they allege that I committed the crime and I'm going to a cell hearing for restoration. And the victim, the petitioner that didn't consent to the protection order, sitting there on Wednesday at 2 p.m. And she jumps up and she is super happy that I'm going to Western State Hospital where you're going to involuntarily administer psychotropic medication against my will. The embracing, yes, of the consenting and the perpetrator, yes, the perpetrating and the consenting, yes, is that one side receives the jubilation of knowing there's a certain amount of justice in the right person having to go through restoration treatment. While the other side, the perpetrator that had victimized the consenting, yes, they are both embraced in the punishment right now. I gotta talk to you.